One sunny afternoon, a guy named Frank was finally released from prison after 14 years behind bars. Frank was a strong Mafia leader who operated several illegal businesses in New York City. When he returned to the outside world, he discovered that his ability had significantly diminished. The Colombian and Chinese drug cartels had taken control of the trade in prostitution activities, killing Frank's previous associates. Emilio, a Colombian prostitute boss, exited his establishment and went to a payphone in another section of the city. Without warning, a storm of bullets came down on him, taking his life quickly. The intruders displayed Emilio's lifeless body with a newspaper item announcing Frank's release. At the same moment, in a hotel room, a man named Jimmy was negotiating a narcotics deal with King Tito, a Colombian drug king. Jimmy's incessant conversation irritated King Tito, who unexpectedly raised the price by 10%, taking Jimmy off surprise. Jimmy was forced to hand over a suitcase as payment for the drugs. However, when the suitcase was opened, it showed only tampons. Jimmy viciously gunned down King Tito and his crew in an instant, taking them by surprise. After murdering the Colombians, Jimmy and his gang met Frank in a different hotel room. It became clear that Jimmy's team was behind Emilio's assassination. Frank was introduced as their employer. Jimmy welcomed Frank back, reporting that Emilio and King Tito had been eliminated as directed. They'd also seized their property and money. Jimmy notified Frank of an arranged meeting with a middleman named Delizio. Frank was eager to learn more and prepared to go for an upmarket meeting site. Frank was received by his lawyers, a few politicians, and a district judge. He then confronted Delizio and asked for his help in arranging a meeting with a drug gang boss named Clay. Frank pretended to desire to relaunch his business activities. After Delizio had left, Frank went for a subway ride with a counselor named Jennifer. Meanwhile, Delizio arrived at a gaming place to meet Clay, who was having fun with his companions. Delizio delivered Frank's message, but Clay dismissed the idea of a meeting. He even criticized Frank for dealing with drug lords from rival gangs, stating a preference for conducting business only with Colombians. Clay instantly fired Delizio and directed him to convey the rejection message. The story took place in a crowded metro vehicle, where Frank and Jennifer were having fun. Suddenly, 3 goons approached and attempted to mock Frank. However, when they discovered the revolver hidden inside Frank's jacket, they were terrified. Instead of killing the goons, Frank demonstrated compassion by offering them a bundle of cash and invited them to meet him in a hotel room. After dealing with the last incident, Frank and his men, alerted by Delizio, rushed to meet Clay. Frank made it plain that all of their company operations would now require his involvement. But Clay refused to cooperate, prompting Frank to cruelly shoot him dead. After eliminating Clay, Frank enlisted the help of his erstwhile associates. Following this, Frank paid a visit to the mayor, asking why funds for a Bronx hospital had not been released. However, the mayor claimed that no funds had been allotted for the hospital, daring Frank to raise $16 million on his own. Surprisingly, Frank accepted the challenge despite his lawyer's advice to drop the lawsuit. While Frank was drinking, 3 detectives, Tommy, Roy, and Dennis, unexpectedly dragged him away. The lawyer attempted to interfere, but the detectives ignored him and drove Frank against traffic to avoid leaving any evidence. They came in a deserted alley and presented Frank with an injured and unconscious man named Enrico. Unfortunately, Frank maintained he knew nothing about the scenario. This infuriated the investigators, but without evidence, they were unable to arrest Frank. Enrico turned out to be a Colombian drug cartel commander, and the investigators suspected Frank of involvement in the deaths of the previous 3 kingpins, which occurred after Frank was released from prison. Meanwhile, Delizio met with Wang, a triad boss from China, at a movie theater to deliver a business message from Frank. Wang insisted on receiving payment in cash for an item weighing 220 pounds. Knowing that Frank lacked the funds to cover the expenses, Delizio offered a face-to-face meeting between Wang and Frank to achieve a mutually advantageous agreement. The following day, Jimmy stopped at a fast food restaurant and kindly offered money to an elderly mother and her grandchildren. Detectives and police officers approached unexpectedly, aiming to ambush him. Jimmy found himself encircled and unable to flee. He was arrested on suspicion of killing many Colombians, with Enrico's testimony used against him. Meanwhile, Frank paid a visit to a troubled hospital in the Bronx that sorely needed federal money. He renewed his proposition to Wang, but they were unable to agree on a price for Wang's items. Frank suggested a partnership in which they would sell the things together and split the revenues to assist the hospital. Wang insisted on obtaining payment for everything. Back at the motel, Frank learned about Jimmy's arrest. Frank, driven by determination, directed his crew to quickly negotiate Jimmy's release. Later that night, Jennifer and the crew were dispatched to release Jimmy from custody. The three detectives arrived on the scene and were furious to see Jimmy set go. Jennifer informed them that if they did not accept, the case would be taken to court. Later in Chinatown, Frank and his guys came and instantly identified the Chinese gangs. They viciously eliminated every triad member. Following the massacre, Frank and his men captured Wong, forcing him to reveal all of his belongings. To make matters worse, after handing over everything, Wong was not spared and met a quick death. A few days later, thanks to Frank's generous donation, the Bronx hospital welcomed the public. This news enraged Dennis, who thought Frank had become the king of New York while they were stuck in pointless employment. He claimed that the law favored Frank, who had all of the money, making it difficult to catch him by playing within the rules. To take action, Dennis offered that a bunch of detectives attack Frank, resulting in a gang competition. Roy disagreed with Dennis's proposal, but Dennis ignored his concerns. Frank's gang was having a good time at a lively club one night, while Frank was on the phone. Delizio eventually came, accompanied by a cocaine cartel head from Los Angeles. This man was aware that Frank had a 200-pound item from Wong and wanted to buy it. However, unable to pay the full amount, he proposed paying half up front and the remaining balance after the sale in Los Angeles. However, Frank insisted on selling the entire item at once. In answer, the man asked for time to inspect the item first. Suddenly, as soon as he got outside, he killed one of the guards, confirming Delizio's collusion with him. It wasn't long before armed men attacked the scene, causing havoc to ensue. During the gunfire, Frank helped Jimmy escape, but one attacker stuck to their car door. When Jimmy tried to knock him out, they realized he was a cop. Frank mercilessly whacked him with a fire extinguisher. The remaining attackers pursued their companion after witnessing his death. Tommy and Dennis were shown to be their true identities. A high-speed chase ensued, punctuated by fierce gunfire. After being hunted for a long time, Frank eventually avoided Tommy and Dennis, successfully losing the trail. Frank abruptly collided with their automobile in a tiny alley, resulting in a horrific crash. Jimmy seized the opportunity and opened fire before making his final escape. Tommy quickly exited his truck to pursue Jimmy, but Dennis was unable to locate Frank in the smashed car. A sudden gunfire rang out beneath the bridge, striking Tommy. Jimmy did not stop there, viciously firing additional bullets into Tommy's body, leaving him critically injured. But, unexpectedly, Dennis appeared and shot Jimmy many times, killing him. After defeating Jimmy, Dennis went to help Tommy, but his efforts were in vain. Tommy could not be saved. Dennis, overcome with grief and guilt for his fallen companions, could not bear to attend the funeral. He decided to leave the procession and enter his car. However, as soon as he had settled in, another car approached. To his amazement, Frank rolled down the window and killed Dennis before calmly walking away. Frank returned to headquarters and confronted Delizio, who had been captured by his men. During the interview, Delizio revealed that Enrico had worked with the police to eliminate Frank. Delizio claimed to getting a $50 million bribe and being promised freedom in exchange for divulging the location of Frank's headquarters. When Frank heard this, he ordered his men to bury the traitor with the blood money. Roy returned home at night to find Frank waiting for him. Frank testified to killing Clay, who had acquired $13 million through gambling schemes, as well as Wong, a Chinatown businessman involved in illegal immigrant trafficking, and King Tito, the mastermind behind New York City's child prostitute industry. He rationalized his acts by declaring that he only killed individuals who deserved to die, regardless of whether they had broken the law themselves. Frank also vowed to hire an assassin to eliminate everyone engaged in his case. Before leaving, Frank instructed Roy to chain himself to a chair. However, as soon as Frank left, Roy broke free and chased him down the tube. Frank shielded himself inside a train car with a passenger. Roy begged him to surrender, but Frank brutally killed him. Frank then calmly exited the station and hailed a taxi. It was discovered that Frank had also received a significant gunshot wound from Roy. Meanwhile, police were informed to the gunshot and arrived on location. The taxi driver, who saw Frank clutching a revolver, quickly exited the vehicle and notified the authorities. They began surrounding the taxi, putting Frank under siege. Frank's injuries weakened him, and he eventually died from his wounds. The moral of the narrative is to live a peaceful and law-abiding life, avoiding involvement in illicit activities, because it can result in chaotic and unpleasant outcomes. It is always preferable to be a law-abiding citizen than the foolish head of a criminal group. Thank you.